Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome back to the next section of our first unit of 11th grade English, the various texts unit. And for this little segment of the unit, what we're going to do is move away now from mythic literature, move away from poetry, and now move into what we could basically just call short stories, okay? Something we're all probably a lot more familiar with. And the short story that we're going to kind of begin with, or just start with, is The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. And you can tell that we're obviously kind of like carrying the momentum of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven into now one of his most famous short stories, The Telltale Heart. So what I want to do is basically read through The Telltale Heart. We're going to answer a few of the most basic kind of questions, the kind of reading comprehension questions here. And there's only like three. And then we're going to talk a little bit about its relationship to a biblical text. So we're actually going to do two texts today. We're going to do The Telltale Heart and then a little bit of a passage from a biblical source, the Bible, in the book of Genesis. And then we're going to answer some questions on that and then basically walk you through the quick write for this, the writing assignment for this particular text. So let's take a look. The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. Now, Poe. So we don't need to really talk about him again because we should know all the information that we really need to know about him from our analysis of The Raven. But this title, The Telltale Heart, a telltale. Now, what is that? That means like something that essentially is giving something away. It's kind of like the telltale sign, right? The clue, the giveaway clue. Heart. So this is a heart that is giving something away, that's telling the story of what really happened. Okay. That's all we got. Now, one other thing that you probably noticed in the title, excuse me, is that this particular story, or this particular title, follows a really typical pattern of Edgar Allan Poe writing, which is that he has a lot of alliteration in it. Telltale Heart. So the T sound, the repetitive T sound, even technically for, even though the sound's not there in the. What is going on here? It kind of gives you a rhythm right off the bat. All right. So there's something about a rhythm that Edgar Allan Poe initially inserts into this story. Sure. Now, look at the first word. True. Is it a coincidence that that T sound is then continued on here? Possibly. This might be just a really, really kind of nitty gritty detail that he wasn't even aware of, but I think it's probably relevant that we have a intro and the first sounds of this particular work. So let's take a look at what we got here. True. Nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am, but why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not deluded them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How, then, am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. Okay, so what a opening paragraph that is for our for our analysis purposes. Couple things here. First and foremost, we get what sort of information here? Basic information. We have a narrator. The narrator is first person. Okay, so the narrator is going to tell us a story about something. And he says that he's very, very dreadfully nervous. He had been and he is now. Why? I don't know. How will you say that I am mad? Okay, why are you saying I'm mad? Why are you calling me mad? Why are you calling me insane? The disease, what disease? The disease that he has sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Okay, so I have a disease. I'm really, really nervous and I have been nervous. And don't think that I'm mad because this disease actually makes me, sharper. You're getting this information, and even with the rest of the paragraph, you don't really need much more information because you can see in both the content of those sentences and the structure of those sentences how like disjointed and kind of quick-winded or short-winded they are, how sporadic they feel. Our narrator is unwell, let's put it that way, right? He's unwell. What else do we get about him? Above all was the sense of hearing acute. Okay, so I can hear really, really well. I heard all things in the heaven and the earth. Really? You heard things in heaven and you heard things in earth. Heard many things in hell. Sounds like our narrator is hearing things. Sounds like our narrator is probably insane. How then am I mad? Hearken. In other words, listen, how am I mad? Can't you hear too? Yeah, okay. This guy is whack. This guy's shot, as we would say. And observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the story. Okay, so this madman narrator who hears things is going to tell us his story. Let's hear what he says. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none, passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so, by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Okay, so what's he telling us here? He's confessing to us his reasoning for why he chooses to kill, to murder an old man. It's because he has an eye. He has a vulture eye, kind of this like hideous eye, a pale blue eye. Okay. Sure. Bad reason, as if there is ever a good reason to murder somebody. Bad reason to murder someone. But something's going on with the eye here. Okay, he's disturbed by the eye. This madman is disturbed by his neighbor's eye. Sure. Give me more. Tell me more, please. Now, this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing, but you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. Every night about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh, so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, that no light shone out. And then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening, so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Ha! Would a madman have been so wise as this? And when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight, but I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man that vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning, when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquired how he had passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man indeed to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Gross, creepy. Our narrator is discussing how he's literally stalking and spying on this man. And again, why is he doing this? Because he wants to kill him because of the eye, right? The eye is bugging him, and he can't even kill him unless he sees the eye. So we're getting the insight here into a madman who has committed murder. We're getting to see why he has done this. Okay. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. I thought that there I was, to think that there I was opening the door little by little, and not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and had perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no, his room was black as pitch, with the thick darkness, for the shutters were closed and fastened through fear of robbers. And so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door. I kept pushing it on steadily. I had my head in and was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening. The old man sprang up in bed and cried out, "Who's there?" I kept quiet, still. I'm sorry, I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour, I did not move a muscle. And in the meantime, I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in bed listening, just as I have done night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Okay. So, eighth night now. He's in the old man's room in pitch dark, makes some noise accidentally. The old man sits up, and we're just sitting there in the dark together for about an hour. Like, talk about unsettling and deeply uncomfortable sort of scene there, right? Okay. Presently, I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh no, it was the slow, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew well that sound. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has swelled up from my bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise when he had turned in bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor, or it is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these suspicions, but he found them all in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. It was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he never saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. Really ominous paragraph there, really unsettling and disturbing paragraph, because the man groans basically because he essentially feels like there's definitely someone here. I'm definitely in danger, but he's not getting up, and he's sitting around waiting for something, and he just feels that like paralyzing terror that there's something really horrible about to happen. And the narrator, the murderer, is talking about how, like, he knows that feeling, and he knows because he's had the same feeling at night, but this time, it's actually real for this guy. And he's talking about, death is going to envelop him soon, like, in the form of him. It's really kind of disturbing. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a simple dim ray with like the thread of the spider, shot from the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye. Okay, so he opens it just a little bit, like boop, and then it was able to put a little beam of light, and he's able to land it on the vulture eye really, really subtly. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, a dull blue with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray as if by instinct precisely upon the damned spot. And I have not told you that what you mistake for madness, and I have not told you about what you mistake for madness is but over acuteness of the sense. Now, I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes, that enveloped in cotton, or when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into their courage. Okay, so he opens the light. He sees the vulture eye open this time, where it had been closed all nights before, and he hears the old man's heartbeat. This is getting him more and more irritated, more and more irritable, right? Oh, sorry. We got all messed up here. So as we're looking here, it's kind of, and like, why is the eye open this time, by the way? It's open probably because the old man, like we said, just kind of woke up and just had, been stimulated out of sleep here. And as he's laying back down, trying to what, potentially go back to sleep, the light, shines on him again. And why doesn't he notice it? Because it's implied that the eye is blinded, so he can't even see, the light of this murderer kind of coming towards him. It's kind of ironically tragic in that sense. But even yet, I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terrors must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, even louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous, so I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet, for some minutes longer, I refrained and stood still, and the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst, and now an anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leapt into the room. He shrieked once, only once. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done, but for many minutes the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eyes would trouble me no more. His eye would trouble me no more. Okay, so he does it. He goes in, kills the guy, by smothering him with the bed, essentially. If you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. Ew, right? So he's gonna carve up the body, basically. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot, whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all. So in other words, he cut him up in a bath, essentially, right? Gross. Um, when I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bells sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart. For what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night, suspicious of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled. For what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure and undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest for their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. Okay, so cops come in, investigate the scream, and they don't apparently suspect anything. And this deranged murderer, right, and kind of the showboatingness of how good of a job he's done here, puts the chairs, of the police officer right over the spot, and his own chair right over the spot, where the guy's body reposes, under the floorboards. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definitiveness, until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. Okay, so our narrator, in the kind of happy triumph of his crime, seems happy enough until this pain, this sound, this ringing begins to irritate him. What's that? Don't know. Is it this disease that he has? Perhaps. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice, yet the sound increased. And what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. Okay, same sound as we heard before. In other words, a heartbeat. Okay. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men. But the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore, I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards. But the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, louder, louder. And still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no, no. They heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony, anything more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now again, hark, in other words, listen, louder, 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 louder. Villains, I shriek, dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here. It is the beating of his hideous heart. Okay. And that's the end. All right. So what happened? The narrator's sitting there with the cops. He hears this ringing in his ear, and it turns into this dull, monotonous heartbeat sound. And it won't go away. And the more he tries to drown it out with his own sound, the louder it gets until he starts to just completely lose it with irritation over this noise. And he rips up the planks and he says, finally, here, it's here. I did it. I killed him. Here's his heart. Okay. All right. So, a couple things here. Let's talk about the questions. How does the author use point of view and tone to create a compelling and unique piece of writing here? So, point of view, right? We get the point of view of a deranged and very, very anxious murderer. Okay, so we're able to see inside of his deranged mind, essentially, what he's thinking, what he's feeling, and all this kind of stuff. The tone here, right? His tone is incredibly frantic and is incredibly nervous and anxious, right? It's this like constant unease. The structure really kind of shows it well there, kind of those constant dashes, right? Just unfinished thoughts, quick sentences, just exclamation marks all over the place. Okay. So very, very unique here. We get to kind of go inside the mind, not just of a murderer, but of an anxious and kind of deranged murderer as well. We kind of share at least some level of his anxiety. What is the dominant object? Which is one of the dominant objects and symbols the narrator focuses on? Why does it cause him distress and anger? What might this reaction represent? So dominant objects and symbols. We have probably just the eye and the heart as the main ones, okay? So why is the eye causing him such distress? I don't know. It's difficult, and we have to kind of break down the symbolism of the eye. At least it sounds at first like it's disgust, right? The hideous spot, the damned spot. That eye is just gross, right? It just grosses him out in some way. Sure, okay. It's a vulture eye, right? He describes it as a vulture eye, like it's kind of preying on him. It's waiting for him to die, to give something up, waiting for it to make him its victim, right? Sure. Well, the eye, I mean, like the eye is an obvious symbol of knowledge, the all-seeing eye, right? It's the idea of like, omniscience of everything being seen, being revealed. Is that kind of what he's getting at least at a subconscious level? Probably. I think that that's fair. And I think that that kind of, checks out with the rest of the story, that he's afraid of some kind of like revelation. He's afraid of, judgment. He doesn't want to have anybody be looking at him that scrupulously. And hence with the kind of the link with the term like vulture, right? It's like a vulture eye. It's kind of, preying on him. It's waiting for him to give something up, which, as we're going to see at the end, he very clearly does. Now, the heart is what? Obviously, it's the symbol in this particular story. It seems to be the symbol of guilt, of anxiety, right? Of kind of shame, or just I would say get like the overriding and overwhelming guilt at a deed. And he hears it twice. He hears it once when he's about to kill the old man, right? When he's getting right up to that moment, he hears it then. And then he stifles it with the actual murder. He thinks that that will stop it. And then he hears it again when he is lying to the police. And he thinks that his noise of his acting can stifle it. Then it's not this time, and it's kind of just driving him insane. So his reactions to that, his reactions to both symbols, I think just key us in that this man is guilty about something, that he's really, really kind of suffering from some pathological paranoia, anxiety of exposure, of being under any kind of scrutiny, of any kind of judgment, right? He's freaked out about this. He's very, very uncomfortable with this. And this is, a universal human feature, by the way. Most humans are very, very loath to maintain eye contact for a particularly long period of time with somebody. It just kind of freaks us out, right? It makes us very uncomfortable. And this is kind of how he feels, except, at the nth degree. Sure. Now, number three, what finally overcomes the narrator at the end of the story, and how? Explain your interpretation. I think it's very clearly a combination of his own guilt and also whatever afflicts him, whatever kind of madness he has, kind of combines together to torment him with the action of what he's done. He's trying to deny, or to literally and metaphorically bury the crime that he has done, either in his mind or in reality. And it's just not working. It can't work because that sort of suppressive mental behavior will result in that guilt kind of springing back up and kind of tormenting him afterwards. That's literally, I think, what happens. Although, Poe kind of combines it with the man's neurosis here, so that it actually kind of has a medical idea behind it as well, of the fact that he's insane. Okay, now why did I throw the story of Cain and Abel in here? Well, because as we're going to see, there's a really clear link between the two stories. So that's the telltale heart, right? So we have that interesting story, very, very unique, very, very Poish, right? We have an unreliable narrator. We have this crazed, dark sort of material. Sure, sure, sure. But Cain and Abel, what is this story about? Well, if you've never read Cain and Abel, if you're not familiar with the story, you're in luck, because as you can see, it's only like 13 lines long, okay? So let's take a look. The Cain and Abel story comes in the book of Genesis right after the fall out of the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. So you'll be able to tell that right away. It says, Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, with the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. Okay, so we have two kids, Cain and Abel, or Cain rather. Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept the flocks, Cain worked the soil. Okay, story of two brothers, basically. The first children of Adam and Eve. So we got Cain. Cain's older. He is working the soil. In other words, he's a farmer. And we have Abel. He's keeping the flocks. He's a shepherd. Okay, so two brothers working two different jobs. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions, for some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor upon Abel and his offering. But on Cain and his offerings, he did not look with favor. Okay, so what happens here? Cain brings forth the offering of his material, right? He brings forth, we assume, vegetables and fruit, right? The fruit of the soil. And Abel brings forth a lamb, in other words, like fat and meat, essentially. And God likes Abel's sacrifice, and God does not like Cain's sacrifice. Okay, fair enough. Not fair enough, though, because why? We have to ask why. Why is it better to sacrifice meat and sheep and all this kind of stuff as opposed to vegetables, corn, fruit, whatever? Not corn, because there's no corn back then, but like fruit of the earth. Why does God like that one more? We're not totally sure, but he does. So Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. Okay. Understandably angry. God's not accepting anything. I mean, he's working his butt off, we assume. And God seems to be blessing his younger brother more. Okay. The Lord said to Cain, so God directly confronts Cain and says, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? Now, I read those and I assume the writer is also kind of meaning for us to read those questions as rhetorical questions. God knows why Cain is angry. He knows why he's upset. So why is he asking Cain this? I think it's very clearly, especially when you read Genesis, the fall of Adam and Eve with this, I think it's very clearly a pattern that we see in God's behavior in the book of Genesis, where he asks these questions because he's trying to get his whoever he's talking to acknowledge something about reality, to acknowledge something, to come to a truth, to admit something. So what is he trying to get Cain to admit here? We're not totally sure. Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? And he continues, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door and desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Okay. In other words, you know the way the world works, Cain. If you're a good boy, you're going to get rewarded. If you're not going to get rewarded. And it's actually worse than that. It says, but if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door and desires to have you, but you must rule over it. So, in other words, sin is going to enter into your life. Dysfunction, death, all these bad things are going to enter into your life if you don't do what is right. Okay, crouching at your door, desires to have you. You must rule over it. Now, Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and kills him. Pretty serious escalation right there, right? So Cain takes Abel, murders him out in the field. The Lord says to Cain, where's your brother Abel? I don't know, he replied. Am I my brother's keeper? Again, God asking, where is your brother Abel? Do you think he doesn't know? No, of course he knows, right? Again, trying to get him to confess, admit, what'd you do? I don't know, I'm my brother's keeper. Lies, self-deception, self-delusion. Yes, you are your brother's keeper, and you do know where he is. The Lord said, what have you done? So in other words, we're kind of moving away from these rhetorical questions of God. God's going to kind of address it directly now. What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Okay. Fast forward a little bit. Because God's going to, lay down a curse upon Cain here. He says, when you work the ground, it will no longer yield crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. Okay. So, what's going on here? Why are we reading this story alongside the telltale heart? Well, let's break down the questions here. These might help. Cain and Abel's occupations. We did this already. Why do they make sacrifices? What does that mean? We, of course, in our modern day, and I've done other videos where I talk about this, but we in our modern day and age, we kind of don't understand sacrifices. We don't like sacrifices. It looks kind of messy, it looks primitive, looks superstitious, all this kind of stuff. When in reality, guys, the fundamental premise of why people make sacrifices is actually pretty understandable, pretty rational. It's the practice of giving something up, something valuable up now, in order to get something even more valuable in the future. Okay, so I mean, we all do that every day. We always, engage in some form of sacrifice like that. So the ritualistic sacrifices that these guys are performing, and all religions perform, kind of does the same thing, or does the same thing at the very very minimally. It will do the same thing. Now, here's the problem, though. You're making these sacrifices to God, or to the world, or to life, whatever you want to call it. And you're expecting to get something back as a result. Now, take a look. For number 3, how does God react to Cain's sacrifice? And what is Cain's reaction? What is his emotional state? God says, your sacrifices that you're giving to me are not good enough. Okay. What does that mean? That means Cain's work, whatever Cain has been doing, is not sufficient to get what he wants out of life. Okay. So Cain has been working for however long, he's been operating his life however long, and he's not getting back what he wants, right? So this is like someone who works to some degree, goes through life, is doing apparently, some form of work, but is not getting what they want out of life as a result. Okay. And he is upset about this. Obviously, he's downcast because he also sees someone else right next to him doing it all really, really well and getting all that he wants from it. And it's his younger brother. Okay. Which, by the way, does what to him? It makes him feel judged or insecure and all this other kind of stuff. Really, really kind of uncomfortable. For number 4, what does God's response to Cain imply, and what effect does this have on him? It implies that Cain sort of knows that he's doing something wrong, kind of, right? And like what? He's just kind of giving these half-baked attempts at work. I think there's some implication of that there when God's like, don't you know that like if you do what's right, you'll get, the right kind of, the good kind of response from me. So what are you doing here, basically? So he's essentially being told, yes, you're working in life. Yes, you're making sacrifices. I will not accept those sacrifices, though, because you know that you are not doing a good enough job. You know that you're trying to, in some sense, cheat the system. And you need to essentially, look at, like, he didn't say this, but like the implication kind of is like, Abel is doing a much better job in some sense, even though God doesn't mention that. We have to imagine, Cain certainly thinks Abel is over there doing a great job. Okay, now, what effect does this have on Cain? We're never told. We just know that he immediately gets up and goes and kills his brother. So we have to imply or read between the lines. What effect did this have on him? It made him, guys and gals, incredibly resentful, right? He hates his brother as a result of this. And he hates, like, what? The whole way God has set up the world. He hates a lot of things. And so overall, we can ask, why did he kill Abel? Some people say it's because because he is uncomfortable by him. It's like he feels judged by him. He feels envious of him, right? Abel is kind of like a constant reminder of all of Cain's inadequacies. So he makes him feel uncomfortable in that sense. Possibly. I also think that it's just the general resentment too. He's just angry about the world, but you could kind of tack on the rest there as well. So then what is the significance or meaning of his punishment? His punishment is that he has to wander about the world restlessly. He will never have rest now as a result of what he has done. Okay, and look at what he's done. He's tried to cheat this system, and it doesn't work. And as a result, he murders someone who he was supposed to take care of, right? And then he tried to lie about it, to try to cover it up. And now he's going to be constantly tormented by his actions, right? As God says, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Okay. Number 7, according to this story, in the story of Adam and Eve, what are the root characteristics of evil in humans? Well, let's start with this one at least. At this one, it really clearly seems to be resentment and hatred about something. And this, story, it's specifically about the envy, right? He hates the way that his brother is doing better than he is, but it's just that fundamental kind of like anger and rage at the world. And then Adam and Eve, we knew what Adam and Eve did, right? They tried to disobey God. So it's basically just people trying to disobey moral laws, right? If you trying to say that you should be the one who decides what's good and evil, not anybody else, certainly not God, right? So a little bit of arrogance there, I think what you could say. So the root characteristics of evil, guys, are yes, an arrogance about your place in the world and the way the world is set up. And then on top of that, with Cain and Abel, it's showing you that the root of evil is just this hatred and this kind of envy and resentment that you feel towards the world, essentially. Okay, what the heck does that have to do with Edgar Allan Poe? Well, let's take a look. Edgar Allan Poe's story does allude very clearly with both its imagery and both its themes, both its imagery and themes to this biblical story. Let's see how. Well, the obvious one, I think, is this idea of, or this image, this motif of the beating heart, right? The sound that is kind of crying out from the ground, like Genesis says. And God kind of, articulates that, and then that leads essentially to the curse of Cain's restlessness, right? So the narrator in the Telltale Heart murders this innocent old man, and then is tormented by the sound of his heart, not necessarily his blood, but it's the core of his blood, right? The organ of his blood is crying out to him and tormenting him as a result now. Okay. So we see that, the restlessness, absolutely. We see also the attempt at covering up your crimes, right? And self-deception and self-delusion and suppressing something that you are guilty of. We see that. With Cain certainly tries to lie to God. And then also the narrator in the Telltale Heart does the same thing with the police, okay? So we have that. We have the imagery and the kind of this motif of lying about our past, wrongs. And then you also have what? The whole either resentment or fear or discomfort of judgment, essentially. Now, I assume that Cain probably was feeling, if not envy, but some level of discomfort and judgment from God, certainly, but also from the presence of Abel, because Abel is essentially a contrast to him. He acts as someone who is like his idol, essentially, right? Who he wants to be like, but he's not. So that's the kind of the flip side of having an idol, guys, is that yes, you can have idols, but they can sometimes really, really put a lot of pressure on you and make you think that you need to be just like them. And so as a result, what does Cain do? He kills his idol. He kind of murders it because he can't stand to be constantly being judged like that. Maybe that's one interpretation. And you can also obviously see that in the imagery of Telltale Heart, because you have the narrator being tormented by an eye, okay, a symbol of judgment. Sure. Okay. So that, I think, is a lot of the clear connections here. So what's the theme then? Okay, how do they clearly link together? I think it's really clearly showing, guys and gals, that when you try to commit an immoral action for whatever reason, particularly because you are, nervous about being judged, right? I mean, like he was like that in the very first paragraph. He was like, don't think that I'm mad. I'm not mad, right? He's kind of like anxious about people kind of looking at him and kind of judging him. If you do that and you let that kind of run away with you, you're never going to have rest. You're going to be tormented by your sins, basically. Your sins are going to torment you if you try to ignore them and keep them away from the world, right? We see that to a maddening extent in the Telltale Heart. And we'll actually kind of revisit this quite a bit. This becomes a little bit of a motif in this particular course, this idea of the guilt that arises from you denying your sins. So I think that's a really clear allusion and theme, allusion that Edgar Allan Poe is using here through the themes, right? He's taking the theme of the Telltale Heart, and he's injecting it essentially into the he's taking the theme from Cain and Abel, and he's injecting it into the Telltale Heart very clearly, I think, here. Okay. So, all of that being said, what's our literary analysis, our quick write have to be about? It says that we need to explain how Poe's short story and its theme connect with the theme of Cain and Abel's story. Be sure to use at least 3 direct quotes and mention at least 2 literary elements. Okay, really simple stuff here in this case, guys. I kind of just told you that, right? We need to explain how the theme of Cain and Abel really clearly connects with the theme of the Telltale Heart. And that theme essentially is something to do with guilt, something to do with tormenting anxiety, something to do with fear, something to do with the fear of judgment, I should say, and something to do with this idea of denying and deceiving ourselves about the wrong things we have done, the immoral things we have done, okay? So those are some basic ideas that we could play with in these 2 stories. What I want you to do is, like I said, take one of those ideas and then explain what the theme might be. So what is Edgar Allan Poe saying about this action or this process of trying to repress and lie to ourselves about the bad things we have done? What is he saying about the effects of guilt on us? What is he saying about the effects of sort of like judgment on us, right? The all-seeing eye, this idea of judgment, right? What is he saying about this? Take that, explain what you think both of these stories are saying about one of those ideas, and give me some three quotes. Remember, we don't need to have two extensive quotes, extensive, long passages, but just some pretty simple quotes. And then two literary elements. Just mention at least two in there, which should be pretty easy because we're talking about, illusion and imagery and all this kind of stuff. So do that. And again, you can quote both the Telltale Heart and the Cain and Abel story. You can quote both. That's totally fine. All right. So that's all we got for short stories. It was a really quick short story, really quick look into the short story genre. The next thing we're going to look at once we finish with this is, I believe, nonfiction. So we're going to move into a quick little unit on nonfiction, a quick little segment on nonfiction. And then we're going to do that really quickly, and then we're going to be done with the various text units. All right, that's all we have for today. Thank you very much, and have a fantastic day.